He had been sitting on that bench for over an hour. 43 degrees. A paper coffee cup long gone cold in his hands. Hundreds of people walked past him, dressed in their Sunday best, carrying their Bibles, laughing with each other, holding their children's hands, and not one of them stopped. Not one of them said good morning. Not one of them looked him in the eye and saw a human being who might need something. And then, at exactly 10:05 in the morning, that same man, that same ignored, dismissed, invisible man, walked through the front doors of Grace Harvest Church, stepped onto the stage, and stood behind the pulpit. The room went silent. Not the kind of silence that falls over a congregation when a new pastor walks in with dignity and presence. A different kind of silence, the silence of 230 people suddenly realizing, all at the same moment, exactly what they had just done. What followed in that church over the next hour was something that people in Millfield, Ohio, would still be talking about years later. Not because it was a scandal. Not because anyone said anything cruel or did anything violent. But because the truth that emerged that morning was the kind that gets underneath your skin and stays there, the kind that forces you to look at yourself in a way you've been carefully avoiding for a very long time. This is that story. And if you think it has nothing to do with you, stay with it. Because by the end, you may think differently. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click the subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Grace Harvest Church sat on the corner of Elmwood Avenue and Route 9 in Millfield, Ohio, a mid-sized town where everybody claimed to know everybody, where the high school football team drew bigger crowds than the county fair, and where church on Sunday was still, for most families, as routine as breakfast. Grace Harvest wasn't just any church in Millfield. It was the church. The one with the stone exterior and the tall white steeple you could see from the highway. The one with 800 seats that filled up almost every Sunday. The one whose choir had performed at the state capitol twice and whose annual Thanksgiving food drive had been covered by the local news for 6 consecutive years. If you were new to Millfield and someone asked where you went to church, saying Grace Harvest carried a certain weight. It meant something. And for a long time, it had meant something good. The man who built Grace Harvest from nothing was a pastor named Ernest Caldwell. Ernest started the church in 1985 with 43 people meeting in the back room of a hardware store on Main Street. He was 30 years old, barely had 2 nickels to rub together, and had no formal seminary training, just a deep, unshakable belief that a church was only as real as the people it was willing to sit with in their worst moments. Ernest had grown up poor in the hill country of eastern Kentucky, the third of 6 children, raised by a mother who cleaned houses and a father who worked in the mines until the mines took his hearing and half his lung capacity. Ernest had watched poverty from the inside his entire childhood, not as a news story or a statistics table, but as the lived, daily reality of never quite having enough, of knowing exactly which neighbors had food and which ones were pretending. That background shaped everything about the kind of pastor he became. Ernest didn't talk about poverty as a concept to be addressed. He talked about specific people with specific names who needed specific things. He believed, in the most practical and concrete way possible, that a church existed for one purpose, to be present with people in their worst moments and refuse to leave. Grace Harvest started in the back room of that hardware store with 43 people and a folding table that served as the pulpit. Ernest's wife Margaret played a borrowed keyboard. Their daughter Sarah, who was 5 years old at the time, sat in the front row every Sunday and colored in her book during the sermons, occasionally looking up when her father raised his voice, which he almost never did. Ernest preached without notes. Not because he had everything memorized, but because he genuinely believed the most important thing he could do in that room was be present with the people in front of him rather than the text in front of him. He listened. He watched. He noticed when someone came in holding their jaw tight the way people do when they're trying not to cry. He noticed when someone came in 3 Sundays in a row wearing the same clothes. He noticed when a family stopped coming and he went and found out why. In those early years, Grace Harvest was the place Millfield sent its problems. Families in crisis showed up on Sunday morning because they had nowhere else to go. Men fresh out of the county jail came in off the street because they'd heard Ernest wouldn't make them feel like criminals. Women fleeing bad situations arrived with children in tow and nothing else and found themselves housed in the homes of church members within 24 hours because Ernest simply called people and asked. Ernest used to say, simply and without drama, anybody can love somebody who's easy to love. The real test is what you do with the hard ones. When Ernest passed away in March of 2018 after a short and brutal battle with pancreatic cancer, the entire town of Millfield came to his funeral. Not just the church community. The town. The mayor was there. The high school principal was there. So was a man named Raymond who had been sleeping under the Route 9 overpass in 2003 when Ernest had found him on a February night, driven him to a motel, paid for a week's stay, and then showed up every day that week until he could connect Raymond with a transitional housing program. Raymond drove 4 hours from Columbus to stand at Ernest's graveside, and he stood there after everyone else had gone, just standing, not saying anything, until Margaret Caldwell walked over and stood with him. Neither of them said a word. They didn't need to. Ernest's daughter Sarah delivered the eulogy. She said her father had a word he used constantly throughout her childhood that she had never heard anyone else use quite the same way. The word was simply, neighbor. Not in a sentimental way, not as a metaphor. He used it literally, practically, to mean the person right in front of you who needs something. The neighbor, Ernest believed, was always the test. The neighbor was always the measure of whether your faith was real or whether it was just a performance you put on for yourself on Sunday mornings. Margaret Caldwell stayed in Millfield after Ernest passed. She was 66 years old, still sharp, still present, still sitting in the fourth pew on the left every Sunday as she had for 38 years. She never became a formal leader of the church after Ernest died. But she was there. And people who knew her said that something in her expression changed over the years after his death. Not grief, exactly. Something subtler. A watchfulness. A patience that had a certain sadness baked into it. When people asked Margaret how the church was doing, she would pause a beat longer than the question seemed to require, and then she would say it was successful. Just that word. Successful. Not thriving. Not alive. Not what Ernest would have wanted. Just successful. The people who caught that distinction were the ones who understood what she was saying. There were fewer of them than you might hope. The growth of Grace Harvest after Ernest's death was, by every conventional measure, remarkable. The congregation expanded significantly. A capital campaign raised over $3 million for a new building completed in 2020, a genuinely beautiful structure with a proper auditorium, tiered seating, excellent acoustics, a lobby with a coffee bar and a bookstore corner, and a production booth that could run live streams to the church's YouTube channel, which eventually grew to over 42,000 subscribers. The church launched a podcast ranking in the top 50 Christian podcasts in the country. They started an annual leadership conference that attracted speakers from Dallas, Atlanta, and Nashville. The Thanksgiving food drive became a full-scale community event with corporate sponsors and media coverage. Grace Harvest was, as a Nashville-based Christian magazine put it, one of the most dynamic and impactful mid-sized churches in Middle America. The congregation was proud. They had reason to be. And that pride, slow and quiet and genuinely well-intentioned, had been doing something to the church's culture for years that nobody inside it had fully noticed. It is worth pausing here, because this is a pattern that repeats in every kind of institution, every community, every organization that starts with a clear purpose rooted in human need and then, over years of growth and success, gradually begins to serve the institution itself rather than the purpose that built it. Nobody decided to let this happen at Grace Harvest. Nobody stood up in a meeting and said, from this point forward, we are going to organize ourselves around our own comfort. It happened through a series of individually reasonable decisions that nobody evaluated in aggregate, nobody held up to the original mission and asked, is this still what we are here for? The senior pastor who presided over that decade of growth was a man named David Horn. David was talented in real and specific ways, he was a clear communicator, an organized leader, and he genuinely loved the church in his own way. But David had a particular orientation toward Grace Harvest that differed from Ernest's in a way that was difficult to articulate but easy to feel if you had known both men. Ernest had always oriented the church outward, toward the community, toward the need, toward the neighbor. David oriented the church upward, toward excellence, toward growth, toward reputation. Neither orientation is entirely wrong. But over time, as David's priorities shaped the culture, something in the balance shifted in ways that were never announced and never decided in any meeting. The shift registered in small decisions. The decision to put the new lobby's coffee bar where the folding table of donated coats used to be. The decision to hire a graphic designer to refresh the church's brand rather than a part-time social worker for the resource center. The decision to add a second camera to the production booth rather than extend the food pantry's operating hours. Each of these decisions, considered individually, was defensible. Together, they described a direction. And the direction was consistently away from the margins and toward the center, toward the people already inside and comfortable, toward the Sunday service as a polished product, toward the version of the church that looked best in the YouTube thumbnail and the annual report. David never articulated this direction. He may never have been fully aware of it himself. But Margaret Caldwell had watched it accumulate, Sunday by Sunday, year by year, from the fourth pew on the left. And the word she chose, successful, carried everything she could not bring herself to say more plainly. When David Horn died of a sudden cardiac event in August of the previous year at 59, the church board found themselves at a crossroads. The question beneath all the practical questions of succession and process was the same question Ernest Caldwell had asked himself 40 years earlier: what is this place actually for? The board did not frame it that way. But underneath everything, the question was waiting. And the man they hired, whether they fully understood this at the time or not, was a man who had spent his entire career refusing to let that question go unanswered. The search that followed was careful and earnest and took 8 months. The board, 7 members, a mix of business professionals, long-tenured deacons, and one retired schoolteacher named Patricia who was the only person on the board who had known Ernest personally, went through a thorough process. Applications were reviewed. Candidates were interviewed. References were called. Patricia asked every candidate the same question the other board members hadn't thought to ask: tell me about a time you sat with someone in their worst moment and what you did. Some candidates answered fluently and impressively. A few answered in ways that revealed they had never actually had to think about the question before, which was itself an answer. The man the board eventually selected unanimously, despite differing from the typical profile they had expected to hire, was a pastor named James Mercer. James was 46 years old, originally from Cincinnati, and had spent the previous 14 years doing what people in church leadership circles tended to describe somewhat vaguely as community ministry, the kind that doesn't produce large audiences, viral sermon clips, or significant donor bases. For 5 years in Cleveland, he had run a re-entry program for men leaving prison, not a program that gave them a pamphlet and a phone number, but one that provided transitional housing, job training, mentorship, and the kind of sustained human presence that re-entry work actually requires. Before Cleveland he had spent 3 years in rural Kentucky communities devastated by the opioid crisis, going in without a recovery program or a building or a budget, just himself and his willingness to show up. Most recently he had served as associate pastor at a small Dayton church better known for its free Saturday medical clinic than its Sunday attendance numbers. The clinic served an average of 60 people a week. James had helped build it from nothing over 4 years. Gary Tillman, the board chair, a 58-year-old commercial real estate developer who was a genuinely good man and a committed church member, described his reaction to meeting James for the first time as unexpected. He said James didn't present the way Gary had anticipated. He wasn't polished in the conference room sense. He didn't bring a prepared vision deck. He didn't have a 5-year growth strategy. What he had, Gary said, was a quality that Gary struggled to name precisely but eventually called a kind of authority that didn't need to announce itself. James listened more than he spoke. He asked questions that the board hadn't been asked before, not about attendance numbers or budget or media reach, but about the neighborhood around the church, about what had changed in that neighborhood over the past decade, about who lived within walking distance of Grace Harvest and whether those people were reflected in the Sunday congregation. The board didn't have great answers to those questions. James wrote their answers, or their lack of answers, in a small, worn notebook he carried. The board voted unanimously to offer James the position. James accepted, with one condition. He asked that his arrival not be announced publicly in advance. No photo on the website. No bio posted to social media. Just a brief communication to the congregation: your new senior pastor will be with you on the first Sunday of October. Gary assumed James was private by nature. He sent the message and moved on. What Gary didn't know was that James had already been in Millfield for 2 weeks. He was staying at the Comfort Inn on Route 9, paying with his own money, and spending his days doing something he had learned years earlier was the only honest way to understand a place: listening to the people who existed at its margins. Every day for those 2 weeks, James visited a different institution in the Millfield community that served people in crisis. The county shelter on Patterson Avenue. The transitional housing complex on Birch Street. The recovery center on the east side of town. The food bank on Garfield Avenue, run almost entirely by volunteers out of a converted 2-car garage. At each place, James introduced himself as a minister new to the area who was trying to understand the community before planting himself in it. He was honest about that. And at each place, after he had listened for a while, he asked the same question: have you ever visited Grace Harvest Church? What he heard at those places requires its own space in this story, because it cannot be summarized adequately in a single sentence. The picture that emerged over those 2 weeks was not a picture of villains. That is genuinely important to say clearly and early, because it would be easy to construct this as a simple morality tale with clear heroes and clear villains, and the reality was something far more complicated and, in its own way, far more disturbing. What James found was not malice. What he found was a gap. A specific, documented, consistently reported gap between what Grace Harvest said it was and what the people who showed up needing something most actually experienced when they got there. At the county shelter, James spent an afternoon with the case manager, a woman named Denise who had been in that job for 9 years and had the particular quality of exhausted precision that comes from years of doing difficult work with inadequate resources. Denise was not angry when she talked about Grace Harvest. She was matter-of-fact, the way people are matter-of-fact about things they've long since made their peace with. She told James she had stopped referring shelter clients to Grace Harvest as a resource approximately 2 years earlier. Not because anyone had been explicitly rude or hostile, but because the feedback she received was always some version of the same thing. Clients who visited Grace Harvest reported feeling what Denise described as tolerated. She was specific about the distinction. Tolerated meant that nobody had screamed at them or asked them to leave or done anything that could be pointed to as a concrete act of unkindness. Tolerated meant they had been smiled at and handed a bulletin and directed to a seat and left entirely alone for the duration of the service and then moved politely toward the exit when it was over. Tolerated meant that the experience of being in that building had communicated something to them, clearly and without a single word being spoken, which was, "You are permitted to be here, but you are not the reason we're here." Denise said, when someone is already fragile, they can feel that distinction the moment they walk through the door. They're exquisitely sensitive to it. And they don't come back. James wrote that down. At the transitional housing complex on Birch Street, James met a man named Gerald. Gerald was 58 years old, heavy-set, with a quiet voice and careful eyes that watched you a beat longer than most people's eyes did before deciding what to show you. Gerald had served 10 years in a federal corrections facility on a drug conviction that he acknowledged without deflection or excuse, and he had been out for 18 months, working part-time at a warehouse, living in a single room at the complex, attending a Tuesday night recovery group, trying very deliberately to build something sustainable out of the rubble of the previous chapter of his life. James and Gerald sat together for nearly 2 hours in the small common area of the complex, a room with beige walls and fluorescent lighting and a coffee machine that had seen better days. Gerald talked in the particular way that people talk when they've been waiting longer than they should have had to wait for someone to actually ask. He talked about what it felt like to come home after 10 years and find a world that had moved without you, and about the particular look that some people gave you when they found out where you'd been, not always hostile, just a brief recalibration in someone's face as they updated their assessment of you. He had hoped that church might be a place where that look was less frequent. He had visited Grace Harvest 4 times in the year before James arrived, going back each time because he genuinely wanted it to work, wanted a specific community of specific people in a specific place to become home for him. The 4th time, he did something that cost him something, more than it would have cost most people, because Gerald had learned through experience that asking for things made you visible in ways that could go wrong. He approached the welcome desk after the service and asked whether the church had any small groups or programs for people in his situation. People who were rebuilding. People navigating the particular terrain of post-incarceration life, where the stigma is never quite absent and the work of re-establishing identity and belonging is slow and daily and invisible to everyone not living it. The volunteer at the desk, friendly, clearly well-meaning, had suggested he check the church app. She helped him find it on his old cracked-screen phone and navigate to the small groups section. There were groups for young professionals. Groups for married couples. Groups for parents of young children. Groups for empty nesters. There was nothing for Gerald. Not a single group that addressed the kind of life he was actually living. He thanked the young woman, put the phone in his pocket, and left. He didn't go back. He told James, without bitterness, just the clear-eyed observation of someone who has processed something fully, it's not that she didn't care. She just didn't have anything for me. And I think the reason she didn't have anything for me is that the church wasn't thinking about people like me when it decided what it was going to be. I wasn't in the picture. Not deliberately left out. Just not in the picture. James sat with that sentence for a long time and wrote it down verbatim. Not in the picture. He thought about all the planning meetings and strategy conversations that had to happen for a community to arrive at a place where a man like Gerald was simply not in the picture, without a single hostile decision being made along the way. The conversation James had with a woman named Carol was the one that stayed with him most. Carol was 41 years old, a mother of 2 children, a 9-year-old boy named Devon and a 7-year-old girl named Amara, and she had spent the previous 8 months navigating a housing crisis that began when she lost her administrative job at a medical billing company after a cost-cutting restructure that eliminated her entire department in a single Friday afternoon email. That email had arrived at 4:17 on a Friday in February. Carol remembered the time precisely, the way people remember the specific details of moments that changed the trajectory of their lives. Carol was not a person who had experienced chronic hardship. She had been, for most of her adult life, stable, not wealthy, but working steadily since she was 19, paying her rent on time, managing. She was the kind of person who had a savings account she had been careful to grow and had never touched, who felt a quiet pride in the fact that she had never needed to ask anyone for help. 8 months of unemployment had eroded everything that stability had taken years to build. She and Devon and Amara were approximately 3 weeks from losing their apartment when she walked into Grace Harvest Church for the first time. She had gone because the sign out front said all are welcome here, and she had taken that literally, in the straightforward way that people take literally the statements of institutions they are choosing to trust. She sat in the back pew all 3 Sundays. She was clean, appropriately dressed in clothes she had chosen carefully from what she still had. She had done the children's hair that morning and made sure they had clean shoes. There was nothing about her appearance that would have flagged her as someone in crisis. Which was, perhaps, part of the problem. The people at Grace Harvest were not bad at seeing people who looked like they were in crisis. They were simply not practiced at seeing people who were in crisis while looking fine, which is what most people in crisis look like most of the time, because managing your appearance is frequently one of the last forms of control that remains when everything else is slipping away. On the 3rd Sunday, during the worship portion of the service, specifically during a song that contained a lyric about being held by something stronger than fear, which had caught her somewhere undefended and opened a door she had been keeping shut for months, Carol had broken down crying. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the way that crying happens when the thing you've been holding together finally locates the crack and moves through it before you can stop it. A woman sitting one row ahead of her had noticed and reached back briefly and put her hand on Carol's arm for just a moment. Warm, present, real. Carol told James that gesture, that single, spontaneous, uncalculated gesture from a stranger, was the thing she had held on to in the days afterward. Not because it had solved anything. Not because it had led to anything. But because it was proof, for a few seconds, that another person in that building knew she was there and that her being there mattered to them. After the service, Carol had stayed in her seat while the congregation filed out, hoping, not demanding, not expecting, just hoping with the quiet, exhausted hope of someone who has been carrying something alone for a very long time, that someone would stop. Someone would ask if she was okay. 3 words. That was the entire scope of what she needed in that moment. The words didn't come. People moved past in the way people move past at the end of a service, not cruelly, not with intention, just moving, already in conversations, already thinking about where they were going next. An usher came by in the practiced and gentle way of ushers everywhere and indicated the room needed to be prepared for the second service. Carol stood, gathered her coat, walked to the parking lot, and sat in her car for 20 minutes. She told James, "I sat there and I thought, that sign out front says all are welcome here. And I think they believe that. I think they genuinely think that's true. But welcome and tolerated are not the same thing, and I couldn't feel the difference in there." James drove back to the Comfort in that evening and sat in the parking lot for a long time before he could make himself go inside. He thought about what it cost to ask 3 words. The cost was approximately nothing. The cost of not asking, it turned out, was a woman who drove away and didn't come back. A family that disappeared from the back row and no one noticed was gone. By the time the first Sunday of October arrived, James Mercer had a picture of Grace Harvest that no board interview, no reference check, no video call, and no church website could have given him. He had the picture that only comes from listening to the people who are never in the room when a church talks about itself. He understood what Grace Harvest had become, specifically and concretely, not as a moral judgment but as a documented reality. It was a community that had, over years of growth and success and the gradual optimization for excellence and reputation, organized itself around the comfort and preferences of its current members so completely and so naturally that nobody inside it had noticed the organizing principle had changed. The mission had not been officially revised. The sign still said all are welcome. The podcast still discussed compassion regularly. But the muscle that allows a community to actually feel the presence of someone who is struggling, the muscle of attention, of noticing, of stopping, that muscle had atrophied quietly while everyone was busy being proud of the building and the YouTube numbers. James got up on the morning of that first Sunday and put on the oldest clothes he had brought with him, worn jeans that had faded past the point of fashionable fading, a gray flannel shirt with a small tear at the left cuff, and a coat he had kept from his years in Cleveland, a coat that had been washed many times and had a fraying hem and a missing button. He had not manufactured his appearance. He had not tried to look worse than he did. He simply wore what he had and left the theater of presentation behind. He walked the 8 blocks from the motel to Grace Harvest Church and arrived at the bench near the front entrance at 8:40 in the morning. The service began at 10. He had an hour and 20 minutes. He sat with the paper coffee cup he'd bought at the gas station on Route 9. It went cold in the first 20 minutes. The temperature that morning was 44 degrees. A light frost had settled on the grass the night before and hadn't entirely lifted, glittering faintly in the low October light. James sat and watched the congregation arrive the way he had learned to watch things over years of working in places where what you didn't immediately notice could tell you more than what you did. He wasn't conducting a scientific experiment. He wasn't counting on a clipboard. He was being present, fully, without agenda, with the specific quality of attention that allows you to feel what a place is before you decide what to do about it. What he felt, sitting on that bench for an hour and 20 minutes, was a particular kind of invisibility that is different from simply not being seen. This was the invisibility that comes from being seen and then, in a single efficient second, categorized and filed and moved past without further engagement. He was not unseen. He was classified. Placed in a mental folder labeled "Not Our Problem" this morning, and the folder was closed before anyone had taken a breath. He counted, without trying to count. Something in him kept track without being asked. In an hour and 20 minutes, approximately 230 people walked past him. 2 stopped. The first was Ruth, 71 years old, white-haired, moving at the careful pace of someone whose knees have opinions about cold mornings, who came to the bench and looked at James directly and said, with the particular warmth of someone who means it rather than performs it, "Good morning, honey, you doing all right out here?" James told her he was fine, just waiting. Ruth looked at him for a moment the way people look at you when they're deciding whether to believe your answer or your face. She decided to trust her own instinct over his answer, went inside, and 2 minutes later came back out with a fresh cup of coffee from the lobby station and handed it to him and said only, "It's cold out here." James held that second cup and thought about what it had cost Ruth to do that. Not much in terms of time or money or effort. A walk to the lobby station, a paper cup, 2 minutes. Almost nothing. And yet out of more than 200 people, only one person had done it. The second person who stopped was a teenage boy, maybe 15 or 16, trailing behind his family as teenagers trail behind their families, slightly separate, slightly somewhere else, still working out whether they want to be wherever their family is taking them. The boy slowed as he passed, turned back, and said to James directly and without ceremony, "Hey, service is about to start, you can come in if you want to." Just that. No calculation visible in his face. No weighing of implications. Just a person seeing another person and saying the obvious thing. James smiled and said he'd be in shortly. The boy's mother called his name from the door and he jogged to catch up. James watched him go and felt something tighten in his chest, not sentimentality, but something more specific. The feeling of watching someone do something important without knowing it was important. The boy hadn't been taught to stop. He just hadn't yet completed the longer process of being taught not to. And James thought, that is the entire thing. The whole problem and the whole solution are both contained in that single observation. We are not born knowing which people to walk past. We learn it. And the corollary is also true, we can unlearn it. The head usher who came outside at 9:50 was Frank Briggs. Frank had been at Grace Harvest for 16 years. He was 53 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, organized and calm in the manner of someone who has taken his responsibilities seriously for a long time and is good at them. Frank coached youth basketball at the rec center on Tuesday evenings. He brought meals to elderly members who couldn't drive. He was one of the first people to show up when a church member had a family crisis. None of that is irrelevant. All of it is essential to understanding what happened when Frank came outside that morning and saw James on the bench. Because Frank Briggs was not a bad man doing a bad thing. Frank Briggs was a good man doing what his environment had trained him to do, which is a far more complicated and far more important distinction. Frank came to the bench, scanned the entrance area with the practiced eye of a head usher, and crouched slightly to address James at approximately his level, a gesture that was itself a kind of courtesy, the kind that comes from being basically decent while missing the larger point entirely. He said, in the low professional voice of someone who has managed situations before, "Good morning, sir. I'm going to have to ask you to move along. We've got a service starting in a few minutes and this area needs to be clear." James looked up at him and said, "I was hoping to come inside for the service." Frank paused. The pause lasted approximately 2 seconds. 2 seconds in which something could have happened differently, in which Frank could have said, "Of course, let me walk you in." 2 seconds in which 16 years of unconsciously absorbed cultural signals about what Grace Harvest was and who it was for played out in the circuitry of a genuinely good man's instincts. Frank said, "I don't think that's a good idea today." James said, "Why not?" Frank said, "Sir, I'm asking you nicely. Please don't make this difficult." James stood up. He picked up his cold coffee cup. He said quietly, "Okay." And Frank went back inside to prepare for the service. Sit with that for a moment. Not with judgment directed at Frank, that would be the easy response and the wrong one. Sit with the thing itself. A man asked to come to a church service and was told it was not a good idea. By a head usher. At a church whose sign said all are welcome. On a Sunday morning. In America, in the 21st century, at a church that had a podcast about compassion and a YouTube channel with 42,000 subscribers. Sit with the fact that nothing dramatic happened. There was no screaming, no threat, no particular cruelty. Just a quiet, polite, professional conversation that ended with a man being told he was not welcome at a Christian church on a Sunday morning. And then sit with this, it had been happening for years. Not just to James. To the clients Denise had stopped sending. To Gerald. To Carol. To people whose names James didn't know and would never learn because they had come once and never come back, and nobody inside that building had ever thought to ask why. At 10:05, with the congregation fully seated and the worship team completing their set, Gary Tillman moved to the microphone with the particular energy of someone who had been looking forward to this moment for weeks. He said, "Grace Harvest, it is my genuine honor this morning to introduce to you for the very first time your new senior pastor. Please stand with me as we welcome Pastor James Mercer to Grace Harvest Church." The side entrance to the left of the stage opened. And James walked in. He was still wearing the faded jeans. He was still wearing the fraying coat. He was still carrying the paper coffee cup, cold, slightly crushed, a prop that had ceased to be a prop because he had genuinely been holding it for over an hour in 44 degrees and it had simply become part of him. He walked to the stage at a normal pace. He set the coffee cup on the edge of the podium with the careful, deliberate movement of someone placing something where it is meant to be seen. He stood behind the microphone and looked out at the congregation. The silence that followed was unlike any silence that room had experienced in its history. It was not reverent. It was not expectant. It was the silence of cognitive disruption, the particular mental blankness that descends when the brain receives input that does not fit any available category. 230 people stared at the man at the podium, and in their faces you could watch, if you knew what to look for, the sequence of recognition happening in real time. First confusion. Then processing. Then the slow, terrible arrival of understanding. Someone in the middle section whispered loudly enough to carry, "Is this some kind of joke?" A woman in the 7th row had her hands in her lap and was looking at them. Gary Tillman stood at the end of the front row with his mouth slightly open. And Frank Briggs, seated in his customary spot in the 2nd row in his usher's vest, had gone a color that his wife would later describe as the color of old chalk, the gray-white of someone whose blood has made a decision to be somewhere other than their face. James did not smile. He did not open with humor to diffuse the tension. He understood, with the instinct of someone who had spent years reading rooms, that the tension in this particular room was not something to be diffused. It was something to be witnessed. He let the silence hold for 10 full seconds, a very long 10 seconds, and then he said, "My name is James Mercer. I am your new pastor. And I have been sitting outside on that bench since 8:40 this morning." The silence changed quality. It was still total. But the texture of it had shifted from shock to something closer to held breath. James continued, "I want to begin this morning by being honest with you, because I believe honesty is the only foundation on which anything real can be built. The honest truth is this: in an hour and 20 minutes on that bench, in 44-degree weather, 2 people stopped to speak to me. 2. Out of more than 200. He paused. 2 people stopped. The rest of you walked past. Another pause. Longer this time. Long enough for the number to be not just heard but felt. I am not standing here this morning to shame anyone. I want to be absolutely clear about that, because what I'm about to tell you is not about shame. Shame closes people. What I am about to tell you is meant to open something. But first you need to understand that what happened outside this morning is not an isolated incident. It is a pattern. And I know it is a pattern because I have spent the last 2 weeks listening to the people in this community who have tried to walk through these doors and found that the welcome on the sign did not match the welcome they received inside. The room was still completely quiet. James told them about Denise. He described what the case manager had told him about the clients she'd stopped sending to Grace Harvest and why. He used Denise's word, tolerated. He said it slowly and clearly and let it sit in the air of that room. He saw people flinch at it slightly, not the dramatic flinch of people who have been accused of something they didn't do, but the smaller, internal flinch of people who have heard something accurate about themselves. He told them about Gerald. He told them about the cracked phone screen and the small groups page that had nothing for a man trying to rebuild his life, and described it in specific, concrete terms that made it impossible to abstract away into comfortable generality. He told them about Carol. He told them about the third Sunday and the crying and the 3 words that had never been said and the 20 minutes in the parking lot. And as he told Carol's story, something happened in the congregation that James would later say he had hoped for but had not counted on. A woman in the 6th row, 54 years old, a Grace Harvest member of 11 years named Patricia, recognized the description. She knew exactly which Sunday it was. She had been seated 2 rows ahead of where Carol had sat. She had heard the crying. She had turned briefly and seen a woman with her head down and shoulders shaking and had thought, I should say something after the service. And then after the service she had gotten caught up talking to a friend near the exit and had looked back once and the woman was gone and told herself it was fine, someone else had probably checked on her. Patricia had not thought about that moment in months. Hearing James describe it now, she felt it return with a physical weight, a specific, located sensation in her chest, like a hand pressing gently but firmly on her sternum. She did not stand up. She did not speak. She sat very still with tears running quietly down her face, and the woman next to her reached over and took her hand without either of them saying a word. The moment that defined that Sunday, the moment that people who were there describe first when they tell the story, came approximately 15 minutes into James's remarks. Frank Briggs stood up. This requires context to understand fully, because Frank standing up was not a normal thing. Frank was not a man who made public displays of any kind. He was organized, composed, the kind of man who held things together and didn't draw attention to himself. When Frank stood up from his 2nd-row seat, still in his usher's vest, the people around him looked at him the way you look at something you cannot categorize. His voice, when he spoke, was not steady. Pastor Mercer. He stopped. He started again. I was the one who came outside. I was the one who told you to leave. The room absorbed this. Frank's voice had the quality of a sound made by something under significant structural pressure. He said, I have been an usher at this church for 16 years. I was out there this morning doing my job the way I have always done my job. And I told my pastor to move along. He sat down. Heavily, the way you sit down when your legs make a decision before you do. The man beside him put a hand on his shoulder. Around the room, in the quiet, the crying that had already started in scattered places thickened and spread, not dramatic crying, the restrained, helpless kind that people do when something true catches them in a room full of other people and they have nowhere to put it. James looked at Frank for a long moment. Then he said something that nobody expected, and which would be quoted in conversations about that Sunday for years afterward. He said, Frank, thank you. That took real courage. And I want every person in this room to hear me clearly when I say this, what Frank did this morning was not a personal failure. It was the expression of a culture. A culture that this community has been quietly building for years without fully understanding what it was building. Frank was doing what this environment had shaped him to do. And that is not about Frank. That is about all of us. Every decision that was made, year after year, to prioritize certain things over other things. Every time someone's comfort was protected at the cost of someone else's welcome. Every time the gap between the sign on the front of this building and the actual experience of walking through those doors got a little wider, and nobody said anything, because it was easier not to. Frank walked outside this morning and did exactly what this church had prepared him to do. If we are honest, and I am asking us to be honest, most of us in this room would have done the same. The crying in the room had deepened into something that could no longer be called crying quietly. And James opened his Bible. He read from Matthew 25, the passage about the hungry and the stranger and the prisoner and the question that runs through it like a current, "When did we see you?" He read it all the way through without commentary, just let it be what it was. Then he preached. He preached for 35 minutes and never raised his voice above the level of ordinary conversation. He talked about the difference between the appearance of generosity and the practice of it, about how communities can spend enormous amounts of energy on activities that look like generosity without ever quite arriving at the thing itself. He talked about how the Thanksgiving food drive had become, over years, the primary story Grace Harvest told about its relationship with the community, the one visible, celebrated event that gave the congregation a satisfying answer to the question, "Are we serving our neighbors?" And he said that the problem with having one big, celebrated answer to that question was that it made it easier not to ask the question in all the smaller, quieter, daily ways it actually needed to be asked. A church that has a food drive can feel, all year, like a church that serves the poor, can feel it genuinely, even while the people who would most benefit from its presence are being quietly redirected away from the front door on an ordinary Sunday morning. He talked about the shelter on Patterson Avenue as a physical place 6 blocks from where they were sitting, where real people he had come to know by name were trying to get through the week and wondering whether the community around them cared. He talked about Ernest Caldwell. He said, "I never met your founding pastor. But I have met many of the people he would have known by name. They are still in this community. Some of them are in the shelter on Patterson Avenue. Some of them are in the recovery center on the east side. Some of them are 6 blocks from where you are sitting right now, trying to figure out how to get through the next week. They are still here. And the question this church has to answer, not next year, not in a strategic planning meeting, but right now, starting today, is whether it is still here for them." He closed his Bible. He said, "What kind of church do we want to be?" And he stepped back from the microphone and let the question stand alone in the silence. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with the words, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this story. The service ended with a silence that lasted almost a full minute before the worship team gently brought the room back. People did not leave quickly. Grace Harvest services typically ended with a smooth, practiced flow toward the exits. That morning, people sat. They sat in the way people sit when they are not finished with something yet, when they are still in the middle of something that does not have a tidy ending. Several people approached James after the service, not in the way people approach a new pastor to introduce themselves and make a good first impression, but in a different way, tentative and genuine, saying things like, "I need you to know I was one of the people who walked past, and I don't know what to do with what I'm feeling right now." James listened to each person fully, without appearing to need it to be over. Gary Tillman found James near the side exit after most people had left. Gary had the look of a man who had spent the previous hour having a significant internal conversation that had not yet reached a conclusion. He said, "I owe you an apology. I had no idea what we had become." James looked at him and said, "I know you didn't. That's partly what I needed to understand." Gary asked what the next step was. James said, "The next step is listening. Not to me. To the community." Gary nodded slowly and said, "I think we have some things to undo." James said, "I think you're right. And I think a lot of people in this congregation are ready to do that work, if someone leads them there." Margaret Caldwell was the last person James spoke to that morning. She had waited in the 4th pew on the left while everyone else filed out, her hands folded in her lap, her posture exactly what it had been for 38 years in that seat. When James came to her, she looked at him for a long moment without saying anything. Then she said, "My husband would have liked you." James sat down in the pew beside her. He said, "I've been hearing about him for 2 weeks. I feel like I know him a little." Margaret said, "He used to say that the measure of a church wasn't what happened inside the building. It was what the people inside were willing to walk outside for." She paused. He'd be glad someone finally said it out loud again. James didn't respond immediately. He just sat with her in that pew, in the quiet of the emptied room, the amber and red light coming through the stained glass and falling across the hardwood floor, and neither of them spoke for a while, which was exactly the right thing. The weeks that followed were not simple. Real change is never simple, and James understood that better than anyone. He had seen the cycle before, the emotional service, the tearful commitments, the energy of awakening that feels permanent in the room where it happens and then has to survive contact with Monday morning and the ordinary grinding resistance of institutional inertia. He had seen communities have profound collective experiences and then, 6 months later, find themselves slowly reassembling the exact patterns that the experience had disrupted, because the patterns were comfortable and the disruption was costly and no one had done the structural work to make the new way of being easier than the old way. He knew that the first Sunday could become a story Grace Harvest told about itself, a flattering story of awakening and transformation, or it could become the first day of an actual, sustained, imperfect, ongoing practice of being a different kind of community. The difference between those two outcomes depended almost entirely on what happened in the weeks immediately following, before the emotional energy had dissipated and before the comfortable habits had fully reasserted themselves. So James moved quickly and deliberately. The following Wednesday, he held an open meeting, not a service, not a program, just a meeting, in the main auditorium. He asked anyone who wanted to come to bring their honest answers to 2 questions. What do we have that we could share, and who in this community needs something we're not currently providing? The meeting lasted 2.5 hours. 80 people came. James said almost nothing. He mostly listened and took notes in the worn notebook, and by the end of the evening there were 4 working groups formed, each focused on a specific gap the community had identified, each led by a volunteer who had stepped forward not because they were asked but because something in the conversation had located them and wouldn't let them go. There were members who were uncomfortable with what had happened that first Sunday, who felt, not entirely without basis, that there was something manipulative about the manner of James's arrival, that a new pastor conducting what amounted to a covert observation of his congregation before introducing himself set a difficult precedent. Some of those members came to James directly. He listened carefully and took their objections seriously. He acknowledged that the method had risks and costs. He said he had made the decision he made because he believed the alternative, arriving with a conventional introduction, spending months hearing the official story of the church from its most comfortable voices, and encountering the actual reality only later, was a method that served the institution's comfort more than the truth. Some were satisfied by that explanation. Some were not. A small number left the church in the months following. That was genuinely painful, and James said so publicly. He acknowledged it from the pulpit, named it as a loss, and did not use it as evidence of anyone's character or faith. He said, "People leave for their own reasons, and our job is not to make people stay by being comfortable. Our job is to be honest and to be present." He said it and held to it. But what happened in the majority of the congregation in those months was something different, and more important, and more lasting. Frank Briggs began volunteering at the county shelter on Patterson Avenue every Saturday morning. He did not announce it. He did not ask for recognition. He simply started going. The shelter coordinator, a man named Al who had been running the place for 11 years and had a deeply calibrated sense for people who were there to feel good about themselves versus people who were actually useful, told James about it 3 weeks in. Al said, "There's a guy from your church, big guy, knows everybody's name by the second week. I don't know his story but he's the real deal." James knew exactly whose name Al was describing. Several weeks later, at a leadership meeting, Frank said something that James wrote down verbatim that evening: "I've been asking myself my whole life what kind of person I am. I think I was more interested in the answer being comfortable than in it being honest." James told him that was one of the most important things he'd ever heard in a church meeting. He meant it without qualification. Frank became one of the most consistent presences at the shelter on Saturday mornings. He knew the names of all the men in the Tuesday night recovery group. He knew that a man named Terence needed his coffee with exactly 2 packets of sugar and that a man named Bobby was working on his GED and needed someone to quiz him on history dates and that a man named Earl was quiet most mornings but would talk for 45 minutes straight about baseball if you gave him the opening, which Frank usually did because he liked baseball and he liked Earl. Frank brought these names home with him. His wife noticed, and said so. She said he seemed different. Frank thought about that and eventually said, I think I've been confusing being a good person with being a good usher for 16 years, and I'm only just learning to tell the difference. His wife said that was the most honest thing he had said about himself in a long time. Frank agreed. He kept going on Saturday mornings. Patricia, the woman who had been seated 2 rows ahead of Carol and had heard the crying and had not gone back, did something that took her several weeks to do. She reached out through the community mental health clinic to try to locate Carol. She did not know Carol's full name. She had only the description James had offered, a woman with 2 children, a housing crisis, 3 Sundays in a row. Through a combination of careful, privacy-respecting inquiry and an honest conversation with a clinic outreach worker who knew Carol peripherally, Patricia was eventually able to connect with her. She wrote Carol a letter, not an email, a handwritten letter, in which she described exactly what she had done that Sunday and exactly what she had failed to do after the service. She did not ask Carol for anything in return. She did not suggest Carol come back to the church. She just told the truth and apologized for it. Carol came to Grace Harvest the following month. She sat in the 5th row. She was there for 40 minutes before someone said hello. The person who said hello was Patricia. They talked for 30 minutes after the service. Devin and Amara ran in the church hallway while their mother talked, which was, James would later say, exactly the kind of thing Grace Harvest needed more of. The Basement Resource Center was rebuilt beginning in month 3 after James's arrival. It took longer than anyone wanted and cost more than the initial estimate, and there were logistical complications that tested people's patience and commitment more than once. But it was rebuilt. The hot meal program opened on a Tuesday in February, Tuesdays and Thursdays, the same days Ernest Caldwell had run it, a coincidence that Margaret noticed and did not call a coincidence. A formal relationship was established with the shelter on Patterson Avenue, providing trained volunteers every Thursday evening and Sunday afternoon, not people showing up to feel generous, but people who had been through a 2-session orientation specifically designed to address the difference between helping someone and being present with someone, and why the difference mattered. Gerald came to Grace Harvest's small group development meeting one evening, at James's invitation, and told the small group ministry team in plain, specific terms what he would have needed to find there when he had visited the year before. Several people in that room cried. The small group ministry team restructured their offerings over the following 2 months. None of these were revolutionary changes. James was careful about that, careful not to let it become a story about remarkable transformation rather than the slower, harder, daily work of actually changing who you are. He told the congregation regularly that what they were doing was not impressive. It was just right. And the distance between right and impressive was something they needed to take seriously, because the temptation to turn the work into a story about themselves, into another version of the reputation Grace Harvest had always been so invested in, was always going to be there, and they would always have to resist it. He told them Ernest Caldwell had never worried about whether the church was impressive. He had worried about whether the neighbor was fed. James said, that's the standard. Not impressive. Fed. There is a question that sits underneath everything in this story, and it is the question James Mercer walked onto that stage to ask without quite asking it in words. The question is, who is this for? Not in the abstract, not philosophically, not as a mission statement. Concretely. In practice. On a cold Sunday morning in October, when a man in worn clothes sits on a bench outside your church for an hour and 20 minutes, who is that church for? The answer that Grace Harvest had slowly, unconsciously, with genuinely good intentions and no malicious decision, arrived at over years of growth and success was, the church is for us. For the people already inside. For their comfort and their experience and their pride in being part of something good and growing. That answer had not been chosen. It had accumulated. Sentence by sentence, decision by decision, Sunday by Sunday, until it was so embedded in the culture that no single person could be held responsible for it, which meant no single person had felt responsible for changing it. Until a man in a fraying coat sat down on a bench and waited to see what would happen. The thing about accumulated cultures is that they are almost impossible to see from the inside. You cannot see water if you are the fish. The people of Grace Harvest were not bad people who had made bad choices. They were ordinary people who had been shaped, gradually and without awareness, by an environment that rewarded certain things and quietly discouraged other things, and who had simply never been forced to stand outside the environment long enough to see it for what it had become. Think about your own life for a moment. Not abstractly. Specifically. Think about the communities you belong to. The groups, the families, the social environments where you have a history and a position and a sense of comfort. Think about who is not there. Not who was explicitly excluded, that's too easy to dismiss. Think about who simply drifted away. Who came once and didn't come back. Who arrived at the edge of the room and waited to feel what it felt like, and left without anyone noticing. Think about Gerald, the person who asked for something specific, something real, and was handed a phone app. Think about Carol, sitting in the back of a room in pain, watching the exits fill and the room empty and nobody coming. Most of us have been both of these people at different points in our lives. Most of us have been in the position of needing something that the community around us didn't have the muscle to provide. And most of us have also been Frank Briggs, standing at the entrance of something we'd been part of for years, acting on instincts we had never stopped to examine, doing what the environment had shaped us to do without ever asking whether it was right. The question this story is really asking is not whether Grace Harvest Church was a good church or a bad church. The question is whether you are willing to stand outside your own community, your own institution, your own environment, for long enough to see it the way the people with the least power in it see it. That is a genuinely hard thing to do. It requires a willingness to be uncomfortable and to act on what the discomfort reveals. Grace Harvest was asked on a cold Sunday morning in October, in the most direct and concrete way possible, by a man sitting on a bench with a paper coffee cup. And what happened next? The silence in the room, Frank standing up, the tears, the Wednesday meeting, the rebuilt food pantry, Carol in the fifth row, all of that was the answer. James Mercer sat on that bench for an hour and 20 minutes and two people stopped. Ruth, who was 71 years old and had apparently never been told that noticing someone's discomfort required a cost-benefit analysis. And a teenage boy who hadn't yet fully learned which way to look when certain people were in his peripheral vision. 2 people out of more than 200. That ratio is not a verdict on Grace Harvest Church. It is a mirror. And mirrors are only useful if you can stand to look into them long enough to see what's actually there rather than what you want to see. James stood at that pulpit and held that mirror steady for 35 minutes. He didn't use it to punish anyone. He used it the way good doctors use difficult tests, not because he wanted bad news, but because he understood that the only thing more dangerous than an uncomfortable truth is a comfortable lie allowed to grow undisturbed until the damage it has done becomes irreversible. The last thing James said in his sermon that first Sunday, before stepping back from the microphone, was this church was built for the neighbor. Not the neighbor in the abstract. The one outside. The one on the bench. The one in the parking lot sitting in her car waiting for 3 words. That is who this church was built for. And I would like to spend whatever time I am given here reminding us of that, one Sunday at a time, one neighbor at a time, until it is not something we say but something we are. He stepped back. The room was quiet. Amber and red light moved slowly across the floor. Ernest Caldwell had said, almost 40 years earlier in a hardware store back room on Main Street in Millfield, Ohio, anybody can love somebody who's easy to love. The real test is what you do with the hard ones. He had built a church, with borrowed materials and volunteer labor and 43 people who had nothing to offer but themselves, specifically to live that sentence out. James Mercer had spent 14 years in Cleveland and Kentucky and Dayton turning that same sentence into daily practice. And on the first Sunday of October, in a church that had grown beautiful and successful and quietly hollow, he handed the congregation their own history and asked if they were willing to live up to it. That yes was not a single moment. It was Frank Briggs on a Saturday morning, knowing Terence's coffee order. It was Patricia Weston writing a handwritten letter to a woman she had let down without knowing her name. It was Gerald sitting in a small group finally built with his actual life in mind. It was Carol's children running in the hallway while their mother talked for 30 minutes to someone who had finally stopped. It was Margaret Caldwell sitting in the fourth pew on the left, watching the amber and red light come through the stained glass, and feeling for the first time in years that the room it was falling into was worthy of it. That is the whole story. And the question it leaves you with, the question James Mercer carried from Cleveland to Kentucky to Dayton and finally to a bench outside Grace Harvest Church on a cold October morning, is simply this: who is sitting on your bench right now? Who is at the edge of the room you belong to, waiting to feel what it feels like, waiting to see if the welcome is real? You do not need to be a pastor. You do not need a program or a platform or a plan. You need the same thing that Ruth had and that teenage boy had and that the whole congregation of Grace Harvest Church found their way back to. You need the willingness to stop. To look. To ask 3 words. Are you okay? That is the beginning of everything. It has always been the beginning of everything. It was what Ernest Caldwell built a church on 40 years ago in the back room of a hardware store on Main Street. It is what James Mercer came to Millfield to remind them. And it is what every single one of us is capable of, in every ordinary moment of every ordinary day, if we can just keep our eyes open wide enough and our feet slow enough to let the person in front of us be the reason we stop. If this story moved something in you, we want to hear about it in the comments below. Tell us honestly, what would you have done that morning? If you had walked past that bench, if you had been in that parking lot with your Sunday clothes on and your Bible in your hand, would you have stopped? Not would you like to think you would have stopped. Would you have actually stopped? That question is not a judgment. It is an invitation. Because the answer, whatever it honestly is the beginning of something. And if this story found you today and means something to you, share it with someone who needs it. Someone you know who is sitting on a bench somewhere, maybe not literally, but in the way that people sit on benches when nobody is stopping. This story doesn't belong to us. It belongs to anyone willing to carry it forward. And if you made it all the way to the end, if you stayed through every part of it, that matters. Most people don't finish things that ask this much of them. You did. That says something about you. Now go use it. We'll see you in the next one. And if you know someone who needs to hear a story like this today, someone who is sitting on their own bench, invisible, waiting, send it to them. Let them know somebody stopped.